One of the most well-known and divisive voices in the church, Bishop Noel Jones, recently made a revelation that nobody anticipated. "I got a divorce." Yes, you heard correctly. The bishop himself has now come up following years of conjecture, gossip, and private discussions in American pews. However, what caused this tipping point? What was actually taking place in the background? And why is this revelation upending his followers around the world, as well as the church community? Hold on, because what you're about to hear will forever alter your perception of Noel Jones. Being in the spotlight has never been new to Bishop Noel Jones. As the senior pastor of California's City of Refuge Church, he has drawn praise and criticism for his stirring sermons, fearless leadership, and well-known friendships. However, a recent personal discovery has generated heated discussions on mainstream venues, church groups, and social media. Now, this isn't just another headline. Noel Jones publicly acknowledged, "I divorced." This narrative sheds light on years of conjecture, the demands of ministry, and the challenges that even spiritual leaders deal with on the rear end. For many years, people were curious about his relationships, personal life, and how he managed to juggle his personal struggles with his work as a global pastor. Finally, we have answers now. We're explaining everything you need to know about Bishop Noel Jones's startling admission in today's video. We'll look at his ministry experience, the real story of his marital difficulties, the circumstances surrounding this pivotal choice, and the repercussions it has had on his followers and church. Some of the behind-the-scenes information we've unearthed will surprise you. And believe me, as the story progresses, it becomes much more startling. This is about more than just a single man's divorce, so have a seat. It's about how this revelation may change people's perceptions of faith, marriage, and leadership in the contemporary church, as well as the hidden truths that many leaders never discuss. We must first comprehend Bishop Noel Jones's true identity before delving into his startling divorce revelation. You must first observe how far he rose and how many people were constantly observing his every move in order to fully understand the significance of his latest admission. Noel Jones was born in Spanish Town, Jamaica, into a large family that valued discipline and spirituality. He was one of 7 children. His mother fostered a strong desire for learning and perfection, while his father, a Pentecostal preacher, taught him the principles of ministry from a young age. His family was full of powerful people in addition to being religious, which is amazing. Unbeknownst to many, Noel Jones is the older brother of the renowned singer Grace Jones, whose career in music, fashion, and cinema took the world by storm. Noel chose a completely different route, the pulpit, while Grace rose to prominence as a symbol of bravery and defiance in society. Noel felt called to ministry at the age of 19. He later obtained his degree in theology while attending Enon Bible College. He then started preaching in smaller groups, rapidly establishing a reputation for his fervent sermons and perceptive interpretation of the Bible. His personality, as much as his words, drew people in. His ability to relate biblical knowledge to the realities of contemporary living was unique, and people took notice of that talent. Jones's fame had expanded much beyond his local congregations by the late 1970s and early 1980s. Soon after, he received an invitation to serve as the leader of the Greater Bethany Community Church in Los Angeles, which would eventually become the City of Refuge. The church became one of the biggest and most varied congregations in the nation under his direction, growing from a few hundred members to over 17,000 members. His sermons were aired on radio, television, and later digital media, reaching listeners all over the world. However, that increase in power also brought attention, and attention brought examination. Noel Jones became into a public figure in addition to a preacher. He made appearances on reality TV, documentaries, and panels. Millions of people admired his knowledge, but many also had doubts about his decisions, particularly in regards to his private life. This is when things start to get interesting. People started to inquire about Bishop Noel Jones's marriage, relationships, and opinions on family and love while he was establishing one of the most significant ministries in America. Noel Jones's personal life was extremely private, in contrast to many pastors who frequently prioritize their spouses in their ministry. Rumors, whispers, and unending speculation were stoked by that mystery. However, as we'll see in the following section, his personal life was beginning to show fractures beneath that polished facade of success and spiritual authority. The marriages and family lives of prominent church leaders frequently become part of their ministry brand, causing the cracks that would eventually force him to say, "I divorced. Consider it." How many times have you witnessed pastors and their spouses stand together on stage as the church's first family? However, things always seem different when Bishop Noel Jones is involved. Even though he bore the weight of a sizable audience and stood tall in the pulpit, his personal life was conspicuously private, and individuals continued to talk more because of that privacy. His relationship status was a source of controversy for decades. Was he wed? Was he unmarried? Was he flourishing in ministry but quietly having trouble in his personal life? Others conjectured that his unresolved personal issues prevented him from projecting the kind of picture-perfect image that people expected, while others asserted that his dedication to the church left little opportunity for a stable marriage. From religious authorities, it's critical to realize that Noel Jones served more than one congregation. He oversaw one of the country's most significant departments, and whether you want it or not, every aspect of your life becomes public knowledge when you're on a platform that big. The congregation was looking for solutions, critics called for answers, and the mystery was exploited by gossip bloggers. According to several articles, Noel Jones was purposefully avoiding discussing marriage since he was aware that it would raise controversy. To be clear though, Noel Jones wasn't completely disregarding the problem. He made references to the difficulties of striking a balance between ministry and personal connections over the years. He admitted in interviews that pastors are under tremendous pressure to meet unrealistic expectations. He talked about how people look to spiritual leaders to be perfect in both their personal and public lives. However, many felt that there was more to the story, something deeper he wasn't prepared to reveal beyond those well-chosen words. After then, there were rumors. His name was frequently connected to a number of women with rumors of unresolved relationships. Some said he was reluctant to be married again because of prior hurts, while others thought he just wasn't suited for the conventional demands made of pastors. One thing was certain, whatever the facts. Over time, the secrecy surrounding his personal life only deepened. Just think of the amount of pressure this placed on him. On the one hand, he was sought after by thousands of people seeking spiritual direction. But he was a man, flesh and blood, and like everyone else, he had to deal with love, heartache, and human hardships. The difference is that a global audience watched his adventure unfold. This tension sparked a flurry of conjecture that never really subsided. As the years went by, many people questioned whether Bishop Noel Jones would ever discuss the true situation in public. Was he concealing a failing marriage? Was he defending his family, his church, or his reputation? People were kept guessing by the quiet. However, that silence would not continue forever, as we will discover in the next part. The truth eventually came to light. Even many who believed they already understood the narrative were taken aback when it happened. Because there was more going on behind the scenes for Bishop Noel Jones than speculations. He was struggling with difficult choices that would eventually force him to utter the words that rocked his supporters to their foundations. "I got a divorce." In order to comprehend why Bishop Noel Jones ultimately declared, "I divorced," we must enter the crucible of his life. Imagine overseeing a megachurch with over 17,000 members, serving as a spiritual father to thousands of people worldwide, organizing many speaking engagements, community projects, and TV appearances, all while attempting to keep a personal life in balance. That degree of accountability is debilitating. It also served as the setting for Noel Jones's breaking point. The lights is frequently visible to those outside, but the shadows are not. They witness the smart suits, the persuasive altar calls, and the eloquent sermons. But they are blind to the toll that comes when the man behind the pulpit must return home to an empty room or, worse, to a relationship that is subtly failing. According to people close to Jones, balance was one of the main challenges. The church always came first. His time, energy, and attention were all consumed with ministry. A spouse may perceive this imbalance as a sign of desertion. High-profile pastors' wives frequently characterize it as being married to the church instead of the man. According to reports, this dynamic turned into one of the main sources of conflict for Noel Jones's wife. There's more though. The bishop's strong, independent, and even uncompromising nature may have contributed. According to his friends, he is a man accustomed to taking charge, making choices, and dominating a stage. But in a marriage, leadership takes a different form. It calls for humility, vulnerability, and compromise. Traits that can be challenging to uphold when the outside world is always asking you to be strong. Those fissures became wider over time. It became more difficult to settle disputes behind closed doors. Private hardships were made considerably more difficult by the pressure of public expectations. And the silence inside the marriage grew deafening as the outside rumors became louder. Things take a turn that most people didn't anticipate at this point. The man who spoke to millions about faith and perseverance, Bishop Noel Jones, was silently confronted with a decision that no one had ever anticipated. Either to continue acting as though nothing was wrong, or to admit at last that his marriage was failing. And he wasn't the only one involved. As a pastor, ending a marriage is not a private matter. In the religious community, divorce is frequently associated with shame, condemnation, and judgment. The risk was more than simply heartache for a leader like Noel Jones. It was the possibility that his credibility might crumble. He was aware that his teachings, leadership, and even anointing would be questioned. Nevertheless, the union had reached an irreversible point in spite of those dangers. It is thought that years of unsaid stress that built up until there was no way forward rather than a single catastrophic event were the last straw. It was a gradual, hard, and intensely personal decision. When Noel Jones eventually said, "I divorced," in public, it was more than just an admission, it was a liberation. He was admitting that even pastors are not always able to make marriages work, something that many other leaders are too scared to acknowledge. This is where the narrative becomes even more fascinating, because it was more than just the breakup of a relationship when he disclosed his divorce. It paved the way for more significant inquiries. What does his ministry stand to gain from this? What secrets might remain unsaid, and how would his church react? The immediate aftermath of his disclosure, the shock it caused to his church, the response from his followers, and how this event changed Bishop Noel Jones's legacy will all be covered in the next part. The words "I divorced," which Bishop Noel Jones eventually said, didn't simply disappear, they reverberated. They shook. They started a domino effect that was felt in pews, pulpits, and social media timelines all around the world. Many members of his congregation at the City of Refuge were both shocked and validated by the revelation. Shock because the fact became indisputable after hearing it directly from the bishop. Confirmation since there was now finality after years of speculation. However, the responses varied greatly. Some of the church's members were quite encouraging. No matter how anointed a leader is, they are still people dealing with suffering, disappointment, and failure. They saw this in their pastor. He received an abundance of encouragement from these people who stood with him while he carried on leading ministry projects and sermons. His candor regarding divorce actually made him more relatable to a lot of people. They believed they could confront their own difficulties if their pastor was willing to acknowledge his. However, not everyone had a sympathetic response. There was a great deal of disappointment in some parts of the congregation. His leadership skills were questioned by some. Some whispered that a godly man ought to have done more to keep his marriage intact, no matter the price. Divorce is frequently viewed as a scarlet letter in the ecclesiastical community. And no, Jones was aware that he would be stigmatized. His disclosure was quickly used by critics on blogs, podcasts, and internet forums as evidence that even well-known leaders were unable to live up to the ideals they advocated. The repercussions went beyond his own church. pastors and Christians discussed his divorce's implications for contemporary ministry within the Christian community. Some viewed it as a sign of weakness, evidence that family life is undermined by the demands of megarch leadership. His candor, according to some, was refreshing and served as a reminder that pastors should never be held in high regard since perfection is unachievable. Then, there were the press outlets. Outlets ran headlines that used dramatic language to frame the story. Videos of his confession and hashtags went viral on social media. Then came reaction videos, think pieces, and memes. Everybody had an opinion, and the story got greater the more people spoke. Bishop Noel Jones experienced mixed emotions in the aftermath. On the one hand, he was at last free of the mystery and conjecture that had plagued him for years. On the other hand, he had to face the fact that he was a ministry leader under scrutiny. After that, every sermon he delivered was examined in a new way. Every statement about love, family, or tenacity was evaluated in light of his own admission of failure. Nevertheless, Jones remained unflinching. He delved even more into his ministry rather than backing off. In his sermons, he tackled the subject head-on, incorporating lessons of resiliency and redemption from his own suffering. Even while others turned away, his readiness to show vulnerability brought many people closer to him. Here's the most unexpected turn of events, though. His impact remained unaffected by the divorce. It magnified it in a sense. Since authenticity is now almost as highly regarded as authority in today's world, Noel Jones became something unique after his confession, a spiritual guide who didn't hesitate to show his wounds. But there were still questions. What did this traumatic chapter teach him? What impact would it have on his spiritual and personal future? And could he win back the confidence of people who believed that his divorce was a violation of religious values? We'll look at that in detail in the next part. How Bishop Noel Jones transformed himself through the suffering of his divorce. How he transformed a personal setback into a new chapter of ministry, and what lessons he publicly shared. For Bishop Noel Jones, the statement, "I divorced," was the start of a new chapter rather than the conclusion of a tale. In his own way, certainly, it was painful, and perhaps embarrassing for others. Jones started to present his divorce as a lesson for both himself and the audience, rather than as a failure. Among the first things that became clear were lessons about leadership and authenticity. Pastors all throughout the world have struggled for decades with the pressure to project a flawless image. They are supposed to have perfect marriages, submissive kids, and personal lives that exactly match their preaching. However, the truth is different. The sense of perfection was shattered by Jones's admission of divorce. He demonstrated to his congregation and the rest of the world that even leaders can experience pain. They also make mistakes. They suffer loss as well. And that unvarnished honesty wasn't a flaw for many of his supporters. It worked to your advantage. The impact of ministry on one's own life was the subject of another lecture. Jones has discussed the demands of the pulpit in a number of settings. There is hardly any time for self-care, much less fostering a marriage, when you are constantly on call, handling crises, writing sermons, organizing community service projects, traveling, offering counseling, and being there for thousands of members. Within ecclesiastical circles, his narrative generated more extensive discussions. To what extent should a pastor give up something for the ministry? When does the calling start to break the person who is pursuing it? However, the lesson on grace and perseverance was arguably the most impactful. Divorce is sometimes stigmatized, particularly in religious societies. Individuals are ready to whisper, label, and judge. Bishop Noel Jones, however, remained steadfast and emphasized the core tenet of Christianity, that God's forgiveness is sufficient to make up for all sins using his personal experience. He reminded them that failure is not final in sermons that followed his confession. Even when a marriage ends, life continues on, and that brokenness can serve as a springboard for something new. And there were others listening besides his congregation. His remarks brought surprising solace to countless others worldwide, some of whom were already divorced and suffering shame, while others were having difficulties in their own relationships. Divorce was no longer merely a scarlet letter. It turned into a common experience that may be saved by faith, healing, and openness. This is where things become even more profound, though. Jones went beyond simply admitting the hurt. He made a concerted effort to turn it into ministry. He started incorporating lessons of perseverance, learning from mistakes, and facing one's own truth even when it's uncomfortable into his story. He urged Christians, for instance, to view leaders as human beings with flaws and strengths rather than as perfect individuals. He did this by redefining what it meant to be a church leader, someone who uses their scars to testify, not someone who conceals them. Naturally, not everyone adopted this strategy. Critics persisted in claiming that his divorce precluded him from discussing family issues. Some conservative leaders even cut ties with him because they didn't want to be associated with a pastor who publicly acknowledged what they perceived as failure. However, dozens of new followers leaned in for every critic who turned away, attracted by the leader's refreshing honesty and willingness to own his truth. Here, too, there is another layer: the silent and timing lesson. Jones refrained from discussing his marital difficulties in public for years. This is interpreted by some as him defending his family. For others, it represents a lost chance for openness. But when he did speak, it was obvious that he had picked his words wisely. He waited until he was prepared, until the ministry could handle the criticism, until he could take responsibility for his statements. He also served as a reminder that not all conflicts need to be fought in front of the public. Silence is necessary during some wars until the appropriate moment to speak. Together, these teachings had a cascading effect. His church's members started to reevaluate their own relationships after learning that if their pastor was having problems, then maybe they weren't. The impact of pastoral activity on couples started to be discussed in greater detail by leaders in other ministries. And people started seeing N outside the church. Jones is a flawed yet aspirational man in addition to being a pastor. However, the story does not conclude with lessons learned, since an unforeseen event occurred following the suffering and instruction. Even the most loyal supporters of Bishop Noel Jones would be shocked by this new chapter in his personal life.